Chapter 7. The confidence of the men in their ship should have improved. As Greenstreet recorded in his diary on September 1st, she is stronger than we thought, and providing we don't get much heavier pressure, we should pull through all night. There was no real ring of confidence in Greenstreet's words. Who could say that there wouldn't be heavier pressure? It was not that they doubted the staunchness of the Endurance, but they were acutely aware that she had not been designed to encounter real pressure, much less the fearful pressures of the Weddell Sea, unquestionably the worst on Earth. Furthermore, the 3-day attack on the ship had left them all tired and on the edge. They had no idea what the future might bring. The novelty was past, and so too was their optimism. The pack was not yet through with them, and they knew it, but all they could do was to wait in helpless, frustrating uncertainty, living through the passage of each day as the drift of the ice carried them north in its own good time, and hoping every day that the Endurance would encounter nothing worse than what she had already endured. Even Worsley, whose spirits rarely flagged, reflected the general anxiety in his diary. Many of the tabular bergs appeared like huge warehouses and grain elevators, but more looked like the creations of some brilliant architect when suffering from delirium, induced by gazing too long on this damned infernal stationary pack that seems doomed to drift to and fro till the crack of doom splits and shivers it, north, south, east, and west, into 1,000 million fragments, and the smaller the better. No animal life observed, no land, no nothing. They felt most keenly the absence of seals, which would have provided both the pleasures of the chase and the opportunity to taste some fresh meat, a treat they had not had for 5 months. Still, there were occasional signs that the Antarctic spring was coming. The sun now shone for nearly 10 hours every day, and on September 10th, the temperature climbed to 1.9 degrees above zero, the highest reading for several months. To the men, it seemed like a heat wave. They could go aloft with bare hands and hands in reasonable comfort. A week later, Bobby Clark's biological dredge brought up evidence that the amount of plankton in the water was increasing, a definite sign of the approaching spring. In the Antarctic, plankton, tiny one-celled plants and animals, is the basis for all life. The smallest fishes subsist to it, and they in turn become the food of larger fish, which are eaten by squids and seals and penguins, who constitute the food for killer whales, sea leopards, and giant sperm whales. The cycle of life begins with plankton, and when it is present, the other creatures of the Antarctic are never far behind. 5 days after Clark's report, Jock Wordy sighted an imperial penguin and enticed it out of a patch of open water. It was speedily killed. The following day, a female seal was slain. But in spite of these encouraging signs, an unmistakable air of apprehension was spreading. October 1st was getting close. Twice before, in August and September, the first of the month had been the signal for severe pressure, and the men had grown superstitious about it. This time, the fates miscalculated by 1 day. The pressure started on September 30th, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Altogether, it lasted only 1 terrifying hour. The attacker this time, a floe off the port bow, bore in mercilessly beneath the foremast. The decks below shuddered and jumped, and the uprights buckled. Chippy McNeish was down in the ritz. The giant beams over his head bent like a piece of cane. Greenstreet on deck was unable to take his eyes off the foremast, which looked as if it were coming out of her with the tremendous jerks it gave. Worsley was aft by the wheel, and when the pressure was past, he wrote in his diary, "She shows almost inconceivable strength. Every moment it seems as though the floe must crush her like a nutshell. All hands are watching and standing by, but to our relief, just as it appears she can stand no more, the huge floe, weighing possibly 1,000,000 tons or more, yields to our little ship by cracking across 1/4 of a mile, and so relieves the pressure. The behavior of our ship in the ice has been magnificent. Undoubtedly, she's the finest little wooden vessel ever built." When it was all over, the crew went below to find that many of the decks were permanently buckled and all manner of articles had been shaken off the shelves. But the ship was still under them. A little of the old optimism began to creep back. The Endurance might just make it. 3 times the ship had come under attack from the ice, and always the pressure had been worse than the time before. But each time the Endurance had fought back and she had won. As the early days of October passed, the ice showed definite signs of opening. Temperatures, too, began to rise. On October 10th, the thermometer climbed to 9.8 degrees above zero. The floe which had been jammed under the ship's starboard side since July broke free on October 14th, and the Endurance lay in a small pool of open water, truly afloat for the first time since she was beset 9 months before. The officers and scientists could now move back into the wardroom in the deckhouse. The partitions in the Ritz were taken down and the area was reconverted into a hold for stores. Shackleton decided on October 16th that the opening tendency of the pack justified getting up steam, and on the chance that they could force a way through. All hands were put to pumping up the boilers with water. This exhausting 3.5-hour job was hardly finished when a serious leak was discovered in one of the fittings, and the boilers had to be pumped out again so the engineers could make repairs. By the time the job was completed, it was too late to get underway. Early the next afternoon, a lead of open water appeared ahead of the ship. There wasn't time to get up steam, so the men set all sails trying to force her into the crack. She wouldn't budge. October 18th dawned a misty, snowy morning. The lead ahead had disappeared, and the ice was a little closer. Throughout the day, the ship felt little nips of pressure, but nothing serious. Then, at 4:45 p.m., the floes on either side of the Endurance closed in against her and kept on closing. Every man on board stiffened, as if he himself had been touched. Several raced up the ladders onto deck. In the next instant, the deck seemed to slide away from beneath their feet as the ship rolled suddenly over to port. A second's pause, then everything movable let go with a rush. Wood, kennels, ropes, sledges, stores, dogs, and men cascaded across the deck. James was caught under 2 boxes of winter clothing, onto which a pile of dogs descended in whining, howling confusion. Clouds of steam rose from the galley and the wardroom where pots of water were upset onto the fires. In the space of 5 seconds, the Endurance was heeled over 20 degrees to port, and she continued to fall off. Worsley rushed to the lee rail and watched as plank after plank disappeared under the ice. Greenstreet stood nearby, ready to jump. The floe to starboard had got a grip of the bulge of her hull and was simply rolling her over. At 30 degrees to port she slowed, then stopped with her bulwarks resting on the ice and the lifeboats nearly touching. Said Worsley, "She seemed to say to the grinding, hungry pack, 'You may smash me, but I'm damned if I'll go over another inch for you. I'll see you melting in hell first.'" The moment the Endurance came to rest, Shackleton ordered the fires extinguished. Then everyone went systematically about the job of restoring order. They lashed down everything that was loose and nailed small strips of wood to the deck to give the dogs a foothold. About 7 o'clock, the work on deck was finished and the men went below, to behold a scene in which every hanging article looked as if it were caught in a high wind. Curtains, pictures, clothing, and cooking utensils all hung out from the starboard bulkhead. Green managed to prepare a supper, while the rest of the crew nailed more battens to the decks below. The meal was eaten with most of them sitting on the deck, one above another, holding their plates in their laps. "We look like we're sitting in a grandstand," James remarked. About 8 o'clock, the floes under the Endurance drew apart, and the ship quickly righted itself. The crew was set to chopping away the ice from around the rudder. They finished about 10 p.m. A ration of grog was issued, and then they began pumping up the boilers again. At the o'clock in the morning, all hands except the watch turned in, bone tired. October 19th was a day free from pressure, and there was very little activity of any sort. A killer whale surfaced in the lane of open water alongside the ship and cruised with graceful arrogance up and down for a time. The last barometer reading of the day was 28.96, the lowest since the disastrous blizzard in July. Again on October 20th, there was little change in the pack. Nevertheless, everything was made ready to get underway whenever an opening appeared. The engines were turned over slowly and found to be in good order. Regular 4-hour sea watches were set. The 21st and the 22nd similarly were days of watchful waiting. The only change in the pack was that it appeared to close slightly. The temperature dropped from 10 above zero to negative 14 degrees. Late on the 22nd, the wind swung around 180 degrees from southwest to northeast. McNeish wrote in his diary that night, "Very quiet, but there looks as if there was going to be a bit of pressure."